Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be going over Motor City Drama by Russell Lee DeRay, talking about Chapter 11. Shifting back to Walter Chrysler and talking about Walter Chrysler becoming a rising star and really another one of the big three auto companies that you still kind of hear about today. Last time we talked about the growth at GM, centering around Charles Kettering and what Charles Kettering brought to the table and what GM ended up doing as far as getting into the railroad industry. That was very interesting, establishing the electromotive division, electromotive, the EMD is what they called it, and building diesel locomotives. Now, they eventually sold that part of their business, as we talked about, kind of relatively recently. I think within the last 20 years, they sold it. But anyway, GM, forced to be reckoned with in the automotive industry. Not just the automotive industry, but in refrigerators, too. I didn't know this, that they had the Frigidaire brand of refrigerators. So that was really interesting. Anyway, guys, let's start with the first slide. Chrysler becomes a major competitor. So what ends up happening? Well, a couple brands were added to Chrysler. You had the Imperial L80, established 1927. This was a very fast car. It had a top speed of about 80 miles per hour, writes Russell. Pretty quick, especially think about this time of period too, of the 1920s. Like, I could only imagine that this would have been like lightning speed to somebody living in this time. And then you had the Plymouth brand in 1928, which was kind of an innovation with floating engine mounts that reduced the vibration and made the ride a lot smoother. And Plymouth was around for a long, long time, I believe, because I remember seeing Plymouths as a kid. I don't think it exists today, but I do remember seeing them even as a kid. You're not even talking about like that long ago. Then we have the DeSoto brand, which was between the Plymouth and the Chrysler. And I think this is in terms of not uniqueness, but desirability. In terms of how special it was, the price, etc. Kind of sitting between Plymouth and Chrysler. If we talk about like Cadillacs at the top and then Chevys like towards like the middle, DeSoto would be like between those two if we're comparing it to GM. But anyway, DeSoto was started as well. Then, this was really interesting. There was this Chrysler building in 1928. That same year, Walter financed the construction of the Chrysler building in New York City. It was built with his own funds and was not a Chrysler Corporation project. He told a reporter, "I was well aware that a rich man's sons are likely to be cheated out of something. How could my boys ever know the wild incentive that burned in me from the time I first watched my father put his hand to the throttle of his engine? I could not give them that, but it was through this thinking that I conceived of putting up a building that could be theirs to manage." So it ends up being completed in 1930, and at the time it was the tallest building in the world, surpassed even the Eiffel Tower. But then that title was short-lived because the Empire State Building went up in 1931, so this was completed in 1930. Empire State Building goes up, and that's all of a sudden the tallest building. But yeah, he built it with his own funds, and I didn't realize that. It was a personal project of Walter's, not anything to do with the automotive company. And it's in New York City. It's not in Detroit. At least this part, the Chrysler building that Russell is referencing here. But back to the Plymouth brand. Plymouth was a game changer for Chrysler. It really was. it ended up becoming, or the Plymouth ended up putting Chrysler third in sales behind Ford and Chevrolet by 1932. And you got to think at this time, there's a lot of automotive companies, I believe, at this time. I'd have to pull up a list, but definitely more then than there is now. So to be third in sales behind Ford and Chevrolet wasn't around that long. That was kind of Billy's project, hooking up with Louis Chevrolet after he had left GM. But to be in third in sales behind Ford, and Ford Motor Company has been around a lot longer at this point than Chrysler had. So by the end of 1932, GM, Ford, and Chrysler produced 85% of the total output of American cars. And lo and behold, you have a big three being born. Now let's fast forward to January of 1934. And in January of 1934, you have the Detroit Auto Show. And there is a lunch for the big three auto pioneers. So in the same room, Russell is portraying in the same room here, we have Henry Ford, we have Walter Chrysler, we have Billy Durant. Pretty crazy, pretty good company. And Russell is writing about this conversation that Billy starts off, and he says, "Fellows, I'm glad we could all get together. I thought it would be a good idea to honor Walter. After all, it's not everyone that gets a special edition of Fortune magazine. Besides, I heard that he is thinking of retiring next year, so this may be kind of a last supper for the founders of the Big Three. I hope no one gets crucified as a result, though. Just remember, Walter, that I brought you into the auto business when I was running GM." And then Walter says, "Yes, I imagine you remember why I left." And do you remember, if you guys remember, Walter famously left the Buick division because of the constant not middle managing, micromanagement and usurping the decisions of Walter. Billy Durant was constantly just making the decisions all by himself, kind of, usurping Walter's decisions. There was that famous scene that we talked about where Billy just ends up building a whole new plant in Flint for something. It was a part that they needed, and Walter was going to source it from another area, another company. And Billy just ends up swooping in and saying, "Hey, we're just going to build a new plant in Flint." And Walter was kind of livid about that. And of course, he ends up leaving. So later on in this conversation, this was very interesting, because Billy keeps talking. Billy leaned back in his chair. "As you probably know, I lost interest in my car company and got more interested in investments. I started some stock pools where people could invest more easily. One of my partners was Joe Kennedy. You might have heard that. They called me the king of the bulls on Wall Street back then." Joe Kennedy, I believe here, is the father of JFK and RFK, I believe, is what Russell is referencing here, because Joe Kennedy was also appointed by FDR, I believe, as commissioner of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. He headed that up. And Billy keeps talking here. "That is until the stock market crashed back in 1929, almost might wipe me out financially. Very tough time. During this time, Durant Motors fell on hard times and we had to declare company bankruptcy last year. But to answer your question about retirement, I am more like Henry, I guess. Work is my answer to enjoying life. I may never retire. I have a new venture that I am excited about, bowling alleys." And this is what I didn't know. Billy Durant kind of launched this bowling alley business. "Now you only find them in fancy hotels, private clubs, and office buildings. I think there is a market for bowling alleys where anyone can go, pay a fee, and bowl with friends and family, and have a drink and some lunch too." So I thought that was very, very interesting. Next, Russell outlines a conversation that Walter and his right-hand man, K.T. Keller, have. K.T. Keller. So, Walter calls K.T. Keller into his office. And he says, I want you to look at this idea I have for a new model. Just look at it, and what do you think? Well, it certainly is different, replies KT. And what are they talking about? They're talking about streamlining. So locomotives at the time were doing this with their designs to make things move better through the air. So reduce, what I'm guessing here is reducing drag, so you save a little bit on fuel. Makes things a little more efficient. Aircraft also had this too, and Walter was calling it, or Chrysler was going to call this the airflow. And they ended up doing it. They ended up making it happen. But at first, airflow cars did not sell well at Chrysler. It was too much of a change. Things looked way, way too different. I should have included a picture of these first airflows. But customers weren't going for it. So Chrysler had to tone it down a bit, make it not as drastic, but they also made it into a brand new model called the Airstream, which was introduced in 1935. So they didn't have it on their already existing models. They said, okay, these are our bread and butters here. Let's just make it into its own new model for any customers that want our previous best sellers. They're going to get it without the Airstream because again, I think we did too much of a change here. So the Airstream was introduced in 1935, and it outsold the Airflow 5.1, putting the Airstream in the black. And I'm guessing the Airflow 5.1 was maybe an earlier model, as Russell writes here. And then what ends up happening is Walter retires as president in 1935. But he remains a chairman and CEO, but he just doesn't get any more involved in management. So he retires in 1935, and, well, lo and behold, one of the pioneers of the big three exits the scene. A little more in the airflow. So Chrysler was one of the first companies, automotive companies that had started doing wind tunnel tests. And they had built the first reduced scale wind tunnel in 1927. So I don't want to say that let's say they were one of the first. I don't know if they were the first, but they did build the first reduced scale wind tunnel according to one of the sources I have on the next slide here. In 1934, Chrysler and DeSoto were the first cars to utilize wind tunnels and aerodynamics prior to initial sales. Okay, well, there you go. I have it on the next point there. First cars to utilize wind tunnels in the testing. So then the airflow models stopped production in 1937 because it was discovered cars cut through more efficiently when driven backwards. So they created a backwards car. Harry Hartz drove the car from Detroit to New York. What I think is meant here by backwards is that they basically reversed. They made the car, when you put it in drive, it drives back, and they kind of reversed everybody to face the other way. And they had a guy who drove it like this from Detroit to New York. And that's how they kind of discovered this airflow thing was, well, it drives better reversing it because the back of the car is more aerodynamic, I think is where the article was getting at here. But they also made some other innovations here with an all-steel body and a frame, so no more wood. They put the capability to have 3 passengers in the front row. Shoot, even my car has that capability. You can put a third person right there in the front seat with us. It's kind of funny. But again, the airflow was a very polarizing car. And from the polling from the auto show at the time the airflow had come out, it showed that it was among the best and worst looking cars. So very, very polarizing. If you guys want to see where I got this information from, there are the sources there. I'll put these in the description as well of the video. And that's going to do it for us today. Guys, thank you so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Tune in next time. We're going to be talking about Chapter 12. The workers get a voice in the Big Three, talking about labor and unions. So tune in next time for that. And guys, again, really appreciate it. Thank you for listening this far. There is a podcast, the Chee-Tash podcast, which you can find on Google, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Samsung, a couple other places too. I actually interviewed Russell Duray, and it was a great conversation. So please, if interested, you can find that in the description as well. And guys, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate the support. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.